Hey there, I'm Corey with Ascend Smarter Intervention, where we make research-based reading intervention easy. And today, wanted to kick off the conversation around data tracking. Specifically, how do we determine which data to track in our literacy intervention sessions? So we know that we as literacy interventionists, speech language pathologists, educators specifically working with students who are struggling with reading, that we have challenges in this space. One, we have to be figuring out how to track and meet the needs of all of our students. Two, we have to be figuring out how we can support each student individually, which is especially difficult if we have a classroom or groups, especially if we have groups who have mixed needs. And then we need to be able to figure out how we can communicate effectively around the data that we have for our students with our stakeholders. So we lovingly call our families, our administrators, our colleagues, anybody who has a vested interest in our students' growth, stakeholders. One of the things we have to recognize is that the students themselves are a stakeholder. So we need to be able to explain the data to our students as well. And one of the biggest mistakes that we see that we've made personally in this field is that we don't have clear systems in place for data tracking, or that we're not tracking consistent data. So maybe we do have data that we're tracking, but we're tracking different things from lesson to lesson, and therefore we can't compare apples to apples because we don't have consistent data. Or one of the biggest mistakes that we can make is that we just assume that our students are making growth, especially if we're using a research-based program, a research-based approach, and we're just sort of resting on our laurels a little bit, feeling like, well, I'm doing what the research says, so certainly my students are making growth. And maybe they are, but we need to know where they're making growth and where they're not. And so we need to be really, really careful about that, because it's a really big mistake that I made personally as an interventionist, feeling like, great, I got the training, I'm following the curriculum, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, therefore my students are making growth. And some of them were making growth in some areas, but not others. And so we need to be really careful of not making that mistake. The bottom line is that we must be tracking data, and we must be clear on what data that we need in order to know where our students are performing. Why? So that we can really outline clear systems, and that allows us to have our activities prepared ahead of time, which really helps us to be more effective in our sessions. We're able to have those activities prepared ahead of time that we know is going to allow us to be able to track the data that we need. So often what happens is we recognize that we've got students who need support in certain areas. And so we, grab activities that are going to target those areas, and then we're stuck afterward trying to figure out how we're going to track that data. What we need to do is we need to flip that paradigm a little bit. We need to make sure that we know which data we need, and then from there we can figure out which activities are going to align so that I can be tracking where my students are at. And this is so important, but it also makes our sessions so much easier. They're more efficient, they're more effective, and it allows us to really see where our students are continuing to need that support. If we don't, we will be lost and confused trying to jot down random notes that may or may not have any meaning after our lessons are over. I hope it's not just me, but definitely I have had instances in which I have back-to-back students or student groups, and I'm trying to jot down notes, and before you know it, you've got sticky notes where you've, put different things all over the place. And by the end of the day, you're like, what does this even mean? You have some random note on the side, and you're like, what is this? I don't know. Maybe it's just me, but I definitely have felt really just discombobulated at times, feeling like, what am I doing? How do I get this all organized? And so if we can go in ahead of time and have a clear data system tracking in place, we know what we're tracking, we know which activities we're providing to get data on that information. And then from there, we can start to really look at that data and understand what it's telling us in terms of students and student growth. So we don't need to have sticky notes stuck all over our desk, all over our clothes. So hopefully at this point I've convinced you how important it is that we are data tracking and that we are data tracking effectively. We always tell our members of our program, like, we're not yelling at you, we're just very excited, we're very passionate about this. So let's dive in. The first thing that we need to do is we need to look at big picture data. We have to start here. We have to start looking at the big picture. The big picture is students' reading performance and their writing performance. However, we need to make sure that we understand where students are performing in the 5 core components of literacy. We need to know what their phonological awareness looks like. We need to know what their phonics ability looks like. We need to know what their vocabulary looks like. We need to understand their reading comprehension, and we need to understand how quickly these pieces are coming together. This is absolutely critical. We must have scores in each of these 5 areas. We have to know where our students are at, because this is going to predict, one, what type of intervention that we are providing and what's going to be the most helpful in terms of their overall growth. But 2, it's going to let us know how long we expect students to be working through an intervention program. The more deficits we have, the longer it's going to take our students to respond. So for example, if we have a student who has low reading scores and we recognize that they have difficulty in all 5 core components, that student is going to take more intensive intervention. It is going to take longer than a student who only has deficit in a couple of the areas. We also need to be careful, because when we're looking at a big picture, a reading composite score, or a big picture, a writing composite score, we need to understand the breakdown. And the breakdown is still considered big picture data. This is not necessarily that granular data yet. This is still big picture data. So if you do not have knowledge or scores in each of these 5 core components, we must start there. So again, what we need to do is we need to understand what is a student's ability really in that phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension, and we throw writing in as well, because writing is the reciprocal process. It's very important that we know how those 2 things are playing together. We simply cannot rely on that one composite score, that big picture reading or that big picture writing scores to give us the big picture. What happens so often is that we start to rely on good data. It's good data. The DRA, the DIBELS, the STAR reading test, iReady. There's so many. The IRLA is another one that has recently come out locally. That's great. That's really good data, and that's a great place to start. But we can't look at that one score, because what it's doing is it may be masking kiddos who, for example, have really strong comprehension and silent reading ability, but really struggle with that phonological awareness and phonics. And so they're compensating, they're sort of covering up for their difficulties. And so if we don't have that big picture data in terms of knowing where our students are at on all 5 core components and what those tests mean, there are a few tests out there that will break down those 5 core components, which is fabulous, absolutely fabulous. However, they wrongly assume that because a student is of a certain grade level or higher, that they've tested out, or they don't need certain skills anymore, such as phonological awareness. And that's simply not true. So you need to make sure, 1, that you have the data, but 2, that you understand how the assessment itself is collecting and reporting on that data. So important. Once we have true big picture data, again, not that big reading composite or writing composite, and that's helpful, not discounting that at all, but that's not the big picture. Once we have the big picture and the 5 core components, then we need to start getting more granular. So, for example, if you had a student who you recognized was struggling in phonological awareness, their phonological awareness skills were not where we wanted them to be, they weren't at target, then we need to start looking more granularly, and we can start to ask questions like, can they determine how many words are in a sentence? Can they tell when 2 words rhyme? Can they produce a rhyming word when given a word? Can they tell the difference between 2 similar sounding words? So oftentimes we have what are called minimal pairs, or we've got patterns that sound really similar, like thin and fin. Can they discriminate or tell the difference between those 2 sounds? Can they blend words together when they're given independent syllables? Sounds. Can they break words into syllables? Sounds. Can they manipulate sounds within words? This is the more granular data. So once we know where a student's phonological awareness is at, if we know they're struggling in phonological awareness, we need to understand in which of these areas are they struggling. Because if they're struggling, for example, with blending tasks, they're gonna have a hard time sounding out words. If they're struggling with segmenting tasks, they're gonna have a hard time spelling words. And so it's really important that we start to break this down further. This is gonna guide our day-by-day lesson activities. If a student is struggling in phonics, we need to understand more granularly. Can they look at a letter or letter group and tell me the correct sound for that letter or letter group? Can they hear a sound and tell me which letter group makes that sound? These are 2 different tasks. So looking at a letter and telling you the correct sound is going to help with reading. Hearing the sound and telling you which letter group makes that sound is going to help with spelling. Can they decode words, nonsense words that follow specific patterns? Can they apply their decoding ability at the phrase, sentence, and passage level? We need to understand that. Where is that phonics ability breaking down? With vocabulary, if we're recognizing that students are struggling with vocabulary, we need to get more granular. Can they define words in context? Can they produce appropriate categories of words? So for example, if you gave them a list of 3 or 4 words, could they tell you these words are all the same because they're all animals, they're all foods, they're all feelings, they're all verbs, they're all adjectives. We need to start to be able to categorize and clump words together to be able to create those neural connections. Can they tell you the function or purpose of words? So for example, if we were trying to define the word saw, we might have actually 2 meanings for this one. But if we were going to define that saw is a tool category that we use to cut function, can they do that? Can they give you that deeper level of meaning? Can they produce synonyms for words? Can they produce antonyms? Can they identify nonsense words out of a list? This is critical for reading comprehension and for writing. So we have to recognize that the reason that we want students to be able to produce synonyms, produce antonyms, is that when they're reading, they might come to words that they don't hear often in spoken language, but they need to be able to recognize to comprehend. And in writing, we don't use the same words all the time over and over and over. And so in order to get really solid writing, we need students to have a strong vocabulary to be able to demonstrate. So we need to know where students are breaking down. Reading fluency, oftentimes we get stuck on their words per minute. Yes, that is a granular data. We want to be able to look at that. We want to see what they look like compared to their age-based norms. However, we also need to be looking at some of these other things. It's the percentage of words that they can read correctly in 1 minute. Can they read with appropriate attention to punctuation, expression, prosody, intonation? Can they identify text inaccuracies and errors? This is all so important because this is what leads to comprehension. Reading fast isn't the end goal. Reading as if we have spoken language, so reading like we speak, is the end goal. So we need to look at the granular data here as well. Then we need to look at comprehension. If we have a student who's breaking down in comprehension, first and foremost, we need to look at, is their reading comprehension weaker than their listening comprehension? So when we're listening to information, can we pull out main ideas? Can we pull out key details? Can we hold on to that information when we're hearing it? If reading comprehension is weaker than listening comprehension, that means that we need to bring that reading ability up to get it more in alignment with listening comprehension. If we have a student who has poor listening comprehension, then we need to be really thoughtful about how we're teaching reading comprehension, and we need to be careful that we're not sort of succumbing to this idea that once they're decoding and their reading fluency are increased, that their comprehension will increase as well. It won't. It won't. So we need to be looking at our data. We'll talk more about that when we get into analyzing data. We need to really determine, can they answer direct recall questions from text? We like to use the 5 W's when we're thinking about what types of direct recall questions might we have. Can they identify that main idea and key details? Can they make inferences and predictions? Can they sequence information from the text? Can they compare and contrast information from a text or from multiple different texts? Can they identify the cause and effect? Where is the comprehension breakdown? We have to know that. It's not enough to know that we have a comprehension deficit. We need to know specifically where. One of these areas, all of these areas, where? Then we also look at writing, and we want to look at more granular data in writing. What do their mechanics look like? Can they produce syntactically, grammatically correct sentences in their writing? Are they able to spell words correctly in isolation, sentences, passages? Can they generate content for different types of paragraphs? For example, informative, a summary, narrative, an opinion, or persuasive. There's different types of writing, so can they generate appropriate content for those? Can they follow an outlined process or graphic organization strategy in their content generation? All of these things we need to be looking at, and we need to be looking at very granularly. The reason is that that big picture data, phonological awareness, phonics, vocabulary, reading fluency, and reading comprehension, is going to drive your overall intervention goals and approach. This is how you determine which groups that you're going to put students with, what type of intervention you're going to be providing, where that focus area is at. You need that big picture data to do that. However, once we get past that, that granular data drives the activities that you're providing in each lesson. So if we don't have that granular data, then we're kind of stuck doing a one-size-fits-all, or what we would call spray and pray, of giving like all the different phonological awareness tasks there are and hoping that we're hitting that student's individual needs. Once we can start to track data, we can start to recognize where are those skills breaking down. This is so important because this is what's going to create those really kind of incremental shifts that are going to create monumental differences in your literacy intervention or in your intervention approach. So I want you to just take a moment of a lot of information that I threw at you very quickly, but on a scale of 1 to 10, I want you to think for a moment, how effectively is your data driving instruction to meet individual student needs? And I want you to sit for a moment and I want you to think, if you scored yourself at less than a 7, is it because you don't have the data you need? Either your program's not providing it, or you haven't had an opportunity to gather that data, or is it because you do have the data, but you're unclear how that data is actually driving instruction? So I want you to think about that. And if it's the first, right, if it's because we don't have the data we need, we must start there. We have got to make sure we have the data that we need. If you do have the data, but you're unclear how to use that to drive instruction, hang in there with us, because as part of this data series, we are going to be talking about how to use that data you have to drive that instruction. So first step, get your data. We got to get that data. We got to get it all compiled. And then the second step, we're really going to look at how we analyze and then how we set our sessions up to make sure that it's easy to get that data, all of that, all of that. So next up, we're going to be talking about organizing your lessons in a way that's going to make data tracking easy. So how do we set up our session so that we can get this information we need without complete overwhelm? So hang in there with us and we will be chatting about that next. Can't wait to see you there.